Zach Fanny, I want to take you back to a world. Listen to me, Zach Fanny. I want to take you back to a world.
Oh, our chat's over? Okay.
Yeah, our chat's over. I want to take you back to
Gotta do some work now, boy.
Shut your... Zach, I want to take you back to a world. It's in the mid-2000s. Donald Trump was just your favorite evening television host that you'd love to see.
Home Alone Extra.
And Bioware didn't even know what a transgender person was. They didn't even know.
They didn't learn yet?
None of us did. We all learned in 2011. And no, they were still aware. Let's not even try it. Let's pretend.
We didn't learn until Andromeda had 8 seconds of that character.
That's the first time characters even knew. People knew that there were others beyond themselves. But no, it's kind of the heyday, the mid to early 2000s of BioWare's development. It's when they went from like the Baldur's Gates, Neverwinter Nights, even Knights of the Old Republic, and really pushed into the current gen AAA titles. They had that EA money slowly becoming behind them. They created 2 games, Dragon Age Origins and Mass Effect, the very first one, the series that pushed it. And if you'll indulge me, I remember there's an anecdote because, you know, if you've been following us at VGS for a while, we've been pretty fortunate. We got to speak with a lot of the people that have worked at BioWare over the years. And I think it was Drew Karpyshyn who recently just left BioWare for like the second time. He's not good there.
I thought that already happened.
No, he came back and then I think he started working on Anthem and he's like, no, this is not for me.
Yeah, it didn't change enough.
Yeah, it didn't change enough apparently. But he told me this story, and I'm going to butcher all the names, but basically the directors there, and it wasn't the 2 guys, the Bioware co-founders, but development directors went to him and David Gator, the very famous 2 writers, and basically said, like, okay, guys, we want to make 2 different sorts of games. We want to make a fantasy game that is kind of Tolkien-esque, but we want to put our own like stank on it, and we want to make like a Star Wars sort of game. We've already done that.
Turbo nerds. What 2 genres?
Yeah. So we love? They picked the pillars of basically all non-fiction storytelling and said, okay, go make something. And Drew Karpyshyn, with the help of many other people, developed Mass Effect, is one of the lead writers behind that, and David Gator developed Dragon Age. And I don't know, it's kind of cool to look back at that and realize that it was like
remember.
Yeah.
Speaking of things gone by, when you're in your first year of college and you're living alone.
Oh, yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, no, it's not a good story. Andy's in school, it's not a good story.
No, not a good story.
And you're like, oh, this really, you know, Bioware's making this sci-fi RPG. And, you know, at that moment when we were, how old were we? We were just out of high school. Yeah, so like 1920.
It's 11 years ago. 11 years ago.
Oh, gosh. Why do you do that?
It's a date. It's a date.
We could eat what we want and the world was our oyster.
That's it.
And you're like, okay, listen, this game is going to be amazing. I don't think I'm going to go to school for a month. I was like, oh, man, that's a funny guy. And then a month later, you're like, Zach, I got kicked out of college because I didn't go to school for a month.
All right. So I am an accomplished radio personality, I swear.
It did work out.
But that did happen. Yeah. That did happen. That BioWare cost me my year. And I shouldn't say that. It was my terrible tendencies that did. But there was something about Mass Effect that really kind of hooked me in. You know, it was something I hadn't seen before. It made Star Wars feel my own. And then
that's what it was. So yeah, that's exactly what it was. Because both these games, I think, like if you played Baldur's Gate, like you were a capital G gamer, you know, back in the day, I think. And Dragon Age Origins and Mass Effect are kind of when these kind of nerd genres moved into the mainstream, and we got RPGs in these genres that we couldn't get before, just technologically speaking. And so we got like fully realized worlds that we hadn't encountered before, and it was incredible to the point that that's like all we're doing. And it was finally like, you know, there's a industry that is really kind of what I belong to. It's back before Gamergate and all the awfulness. And it's like at the moment of like budding possibility here that was so positive.
The eclipse is the sun is just coming over the ridge. And now we look at games, and every Madden title has the RPG mechanics that Dragon Age Origins did. It became commodified almost.
Do you want to play football as a dwarf, an elf, a human?
No, do you want to play football? Okay, you have to watch this 8-hour video and try and decide these emotional choices between your impoverished background. It's actually a lot of fun. Like, it's actually fun. Like, I watched them all. I don't want to play football games, but like, it's a good story. But
that's why this show's called Dialogue Wheel, right? Because like, that's the games that we grew up with and love.
Exactly. And it was the choices that you had on that little dialogue wheel, and how amazing it felt, the idea that you could make this story your own. And today, we both love these game franchises so much, but we are going to try to figure out Mass Effect versus Dragon Age. Which franchise is really the perfect embodiment of BioWare's design strategy? We're not going to use words like better or best, because these are already superlative. They basically are the best already. I just thought it was interesting to look at what people at BioWare have said previously about their design strategies and the clear patterns that go into their design methods, and which franchise and series kind of stuck to that better and realized that dream that will lead to the perfect archetype, the Ubermensch for, probably shouldn't say that, for the a next great game. So the first thing that I want to do before we dive in, it was basically a coin toss. I got very lucky. I landed with Dragon Age Origins. Fanny is doing Mass Effect, so I will be the chief advocate for Dragon Age Origins. Fanny this week is going for Mass Effect, and we'll see how this goes. And if we're
if you have to,
if we're lucky, we'll continue with this next week, and maybe even the week after that, go through the whole franchise. But the important question before we say any more words: what was BioWare's design principles? Because looking back, it's kind of easy to pick and choose things that you think work the best. But there was a quote here from BioWare co-founder Ray Mizuka, I always say his name wrong, about their strategy. And he said pretty simply, looking at a game and thinking about how does it make you feel is our thoughtful way of approaching game design, considering what you're building in terms of the impact on player emotion. We're all humans, and we're all driven by emotion. That's what entertainment is for. It allows us to pursue aspiration, dreams, and to experience the thrill of combat, victory, hate, love, every combination. That's what we try to put in our games, genuine emotion. So the BioWare design principles we've kind of decided based on the source material is the idea of impact on player emotion, how the progression of the story and the development of the story affected you as a player in your feels. The idea of player choice, that interactivity that a player had, because it's a video game. That's the very key thing. It's not only how this movie affects you, it's how you were able to interact and change it. And I think this is one of the most interesting ones, the world building consistency. These are vast, deep, like impenetrable worlds that stand alone in the world of video games, in the setting. These are some of the best worlds that I think any minds have ever came together to create, but they have a need for consistency that I think kind of builds it all together. So if you're playing at home, those are the categories that you should consider when measuring these sort of games up: player choice, world building, and impact on player emotion. Man. How many hours do you think we played on both these sort of games?
Oh man,
it's a little embarrassing, but go ahead.
Yeah, the first half of my 20s. Yeah, I wasn't having relationships with people yet. It was just relationships with BioWare characters. That's how much I played.
How
them.
Fulfilling was that in comparison to the people ones now?
I wish I could go back. No, it's life is just more complex and like inevitably painful now, and I can't just synthesize everything and solve the world's problems. So, I'm sadder, but which means I like enjoy going back and having this retrospective.
It was kind of a special time, at least in our development. I think there's a lot of people that are in their late 20s that feel the same way. That
this is when we could buy our own consoles. Really, like the first time we did, really, and you think, well, oh my god, I actually am making money with these crappy jobs, time to buy all of these video games when they're $59. Was that? Yeah.
It was about $59, and they're about $60 Canadian. And I really think that point in time, about 10 years ago for gaming, was kind of like what you said. It was the eclipse when there were obviously games beforehand that had something to say, but there were certain barriers that made it harder for general people to appreciate the deeper themes and narratives that were being built. These sort of games, Dragon Age and Mass Effect, went over that gap that made people who were even laymen's really understand that this is an expression that should be coveted. I think maybe that's why these...
It's when you get, other than Grand Theft Auto, this is when you really start seeing games pop up on the news. Like, remember Mass Effect 1 and CNN kept playing like the side boob clip of like, you can have sex. Yeah. In some space opera, and you know it's going to cause all these terrible things.
Embrace eternity, Zach Fanny.
Embrace eternity. Her eyes go black. She's satanic. She's making you have sex. Yeah. What is this game even doing?
But they were both very important to us, and I think very important to the medium. Mr. Fanny, if you will allow me, may I start with my tasty origins?
If you have to. It is really good. I really love this game.
We both love these. Again, it was a coin toss. Yeah. I chose this one. I was able to get this. So let's begin. Of course, Dragon Age Origins, everyone knows, came out in 2009 in November. It had the lead writer of David Gator, designers Mike Laidlaw, James Olin. And it was that meshing of heroic fantasy, high and low, a spiritual successor to the games we talked about before, Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Night. It had still connections to those previous games while still trying to do something new. It introduced the third-person perspective, the top-down, or rather that was the traditional perspective of the top-down strategic look, but there also was the option to go more third-person and be more involved with the action. So it was trying to make it a little more modern while still not losing some of the strategic elements. And admittedly, for me, that was the biggest drawback to what this game offered, was the fact that, the strategic elements to gameplay kind of almost took me out of the narrative experience in a lot of different ways, because unless you're playing on the simplest difficulty, it was something you had to actually consider. And it took you out of the very cinematic view that you had sometimes when you were just like over top and you clearly saw that this was, a little pixel character.
You can see like the PC influence there, right? Like
very, very much.
Yeah.
And it was still on PC, but it was welcomed on the new consoles. The big thing about this, of course, was the introduction of the story. These beautiful, beautiful stories: the Grey Wardens, the Darkspawn, the idea of magic being enslaved. Do you remember that, Fanny? The first time you went to the tower?
That might be my favorite thing about Dragon Age as a franchise, is how it conceives of magic and the fate and everything around that is not just something that you materialize with words, but it's kind of like a realm that like houses our ids and our our super egos, and like the truths about us are hidden within there, and our kind of subconscious can come back and attack us, and it's something that is dangerous
in demons that represent pride and desire and things like that. So it's a little on the nose,
and the danger of like giving your deepest desires power. And like I thought that was the most brilliant and original aspect to this otherwise pretty Tolkien-esque world, like elves and the orcs, Darkspawn. Yeah. It's not as original, I think, as Mass Effect, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah, no, we'll get into that to begin with. So I agree. Magic is one of the big highlights of it. The introduction of characters that would continue on with you in the story, those real companions, the NPC characters that Bioware became famous for, really evolved in this sort of game where you have characters like Alistair and Alistar and Liliana and just Morgan, of course, and Sten. That's the first time we were introduced to the character of Sten, Fanny. Sten.
Yeah, he was great. Giving him what did he like? His paintings as the gift?
No, he was big on the cookies. He had the whole very special thing if he got cookies.
Oh, was it? Yeah, I thought he was the art guy.
Too. He might like paintings.
Yeah.
Who doesn't, right?
Who does? Yeah, I love that. The little gifts. Like, oh, I found this little ring. Would you like it?
Hey,
all right.
So we look at that and the whole influence system that was interesting, that provided a level of player activity. So we talked before about player choice and how it affects the game. I think that Dragon Age Origins, of all of the games that Bioware has created, these 6 that we're looking at. Oh, by the way, I should say we're not talking about Andromeda. That's removed from this equation. I think,
God.
yeah, because then it would just be unfair. The player choice and interactivity that you get with Dragon Age Origins is unparalleled in the series. The origin concept of where the game gets its namesake, that you were able to play, in many cases, for several hours in a standalone story that would form around your character. You weren't playing as Commander Shepard, you were playing as a noble dwarf, you were playing as an elf commoner, and that motivation for even why you're a Grey Warden and why you're in this story became very special to you. And for someone that's getting involved with these games, it made them really connect in ways that seemed more natural. Like a lot of games will force an objective in front of you that may be a little derivative and just be like, okay, you have to kill these bad guys because these are the good guys.
Well, that origin dynamic, maybe that's the most brilliant part mechanically of this game. And that's why I spent so many hours playing it and going through the different origins, because it situates you and your character in a game world like we have never seen previous to this point in gaming.
That connection, so that means, right? The connection.
Yeah,
you are that noble dwarf, you know?
And I was so impressed that throughout the game, there's so many moments of interacting with other species and political systems where that background that you have is called into focus, and it brings people's attitudes towards you, brings their attitudes down on you in a different way. And that's really that's such a genius idea, because it conveys like a central, human truth of being a sentient social life form, is that the sociocultural historical conditions of your upbringing are going to impact not just how you tackle problems and experiences in the world, but how people deal with you. And it really lends power to the metaphors and themes around oppression.
Yeah, because of what you said, you interact with these problems on such a direct level. And playing the game and going to Orzammar as a noble dwarf versus playing and going as like an elf, it's an entirely different experience. It's
Who's your favorite?
A noble dwarf, without question.
Yeah,
that when you got to see the effects that you had on this family, and you remember your second Gorham. You remember him?
Yeah.
You find him in Denerim later, and he's like, dude, I'm like, that was a uniquely powerful moment for me, because this was a guy that we were involved in a caste system that was very interesting in Orzammar, in this dwarf political system. And he was your second, and you were essentially thrown to the wolves, and you were able to escape, and you didn't know what happened to this man that, based on your choices, normally would stand by your side and be with you to the end. And 30 hours later, when you reach one of the final cities, you see that this character that meant so much to you in the primacy of this game moved on too, and kind of went on his own sort of journey. And you say to him, naturally, you say to Gorham, like, hey, come on in, join me. And they actually made it. So this character says, like, no, man, like I got my family now. Like I've moved on. That is such a brave and unrelenting choice,
It's so true. Like that's the thing with these games, they strike something so true in their storytelling, because that they treat each of those characters, even the ancillary ones, like fully realized beings. And so that they have to address the tragedy of just growing and changing within time, right? Like your relationships with people are going to change and fade away, like almost necessarily. And that kind of really brings that into focus here, especially because you come from that background with the dwarf origin story. You've come from a background of like privilege and power, and so you can't just like call upon this guy's responsibility to you in the same way that you're used to being able to do. And so it's kind of deconstructing that position as well. Like I think now I agree with you about the dwarf one. That was my favorite to play. But I think now with my current attitude, I really like the elf storyline of like that, just being from nothing.
That also deals with rape too, like very enslavement and rape. I remember if you do choose that storyline, your cousin gets raped because the elves are chattel in the system. And then you meet literally the king of this entire realm, and you say to him, like, yeah, I was in your host city, my cousin was raped by nobles, and you get this shock in his face and these choices that were made, and that motivation stays with you and affects how you change the story later.
It's like, instead of dealing with like privilege as kind of something to deconstruct and use as a motivating factor, it's trauma. And the fact that you have those two, I guess those are really the two poles in those origin stories, and you can have them exist so cohesively in the same game world and narrative is just astonishing. Like, that's an all-time accomplishment.
And they're a little fortunate too because they didn't have exactly the same graphical requirements that Mass Effect did. And you could have a lot more variables because it didn't have to look as unbelievably beautiful as Mass Effect, even though Mass Effect came out earlier. We talked about the origin here and, again, the different themes that were presented. What I think really blew me away as well was how this all finished up. After you complete the game, you make a very impactful choice that affects, again, the world and your emotion to these characters. You have a 5 to 7 minute sequence, the prologue, where depending on the choices you made, you have dozens, if not hundreds, of permutations of final choices to make this journey really special. And I think that's what BioWare understood maybe more than any other game development company in the world, is that it's not always about where you end up, it's about the journey. And when at the very end, you can make little choices that make things special to you. We talked about Gorham and that relationship. If you beat the game and live as a dwarf noble, you have the opportunity to restore him of all of his rights. And you can see that character's kind of turmoil in that sort of about whether he wants to go home. You can change the course of history. And as your own character, as the Grey Warden, you have the option to just say, fuck all this. This is fun. I'm going to go mess around with the Canary in Stanton and just have a good time with him. And you make it personal because it's based on the relationships you had. Like, that's the other go ahead.
And I think that's what makes these games feel like weighted in a sense, is that it's not just like you solve the world problem. It's that you've kind of changed, for better and worse. It's almost always a mix. You've changed the course of the history of the world that you're working in. And so like the epilogue and kind of the post credits, scene and choice making allows you to feel like this world is really continuing without you. I think that's so key in any piece of fiction of any medium, to feel that like in terms of world building, which is one of our criteria, is that this world continues even if I'm not in it. And doing things like that, I think it seems like pretty minor, but it really adds to that quality. And that's what I really loved about Inquisition as well.
Yeah, because we got to see a completion of a lot of those things. Yeah. It was interesting.
Like this is an end maybe to your chapter, even a chapter even in your own life.
Yeah.
Maybe an end to your actual life, depending on how you play it. Mm-hmm. But that's not the be all end all of the story itself. Yeah.
I think we'll go into that with Mass Effect momentarily, but I think Mass Effect might have a big edge when it comes to that connectivity of a world that continues without, because of the centralized character. But you talked about that a little bit there with Origins, that the world keeps living and, the choices were yours. We forget that the influence system also affects those choices. So if you really got along with these characters, did all the right things, gave them all the right gifts, which is admittedly is a little bit derivative, you then have interactions that are even more special, like the character Shale. You remember it was the Dwarven stone woman? Yeah, right. There we go. Yeah. Depending on your relationship, her entire goals and what she wants to do with her life is dramatically different, and how you interact with these characters changes. And it's another way that all of this stuff feels special. And
like you have a responsibility to them, right? Because
you absolutely feel like you have a responsibility to them.
Characters are vulnerable, both your companions and the minor ancillary characters, and you can choose how to handle that vulnerability. And I think gaming is so much a synonym now for being crass and having a lack of empathy, because we're sitting behind a screen and we can shout slurs at people without having any consequence. But these kinds of RPGs really work against that and show the capacity of games to help you develop into a fully fulfilled, empathetic human being, because it's showing you, how you can actually impact people around you in this tangible way. And I think it's so that is, I think, a brilliant thing to have children practice doing, for instance. And it makes these stories feel like I actually can have consequence, not just by killing the dragon, but by talking to the person that's having a bad time out in the corner there. And I love that kind of attention to detail.
To figure out what's hurting that person, and to understand that you could make a difference, and the pros of consequence in a little bit. Like we get to feel that there is a consequence to this story and the story we built. And you don't get we're I think surrounding a little bit, but let's hit it right in the head. You don't get that with anything else. that this is a story you built with your thoughts thanks to the geniuses that gave you the tools. And it is special to you that ending that you just got won't actually be the same as anyone else's because of what that experience was, because it is a sum total of all the choices you made along the way. And you're absolutely right. That is directly connecting to how we live our lives and the choices that we live to other people. So that, I think, is Dragon Age Origins in essentially a nutshell, a relatively short nutshell. Basically how it was able to connect with the idea of player choice, the emotional impact that you had about what's better for the world of this particular world. Should I get rid of Logain? What should I do? Should I get rid of myself?
That guy.
Yeah, of course you fuck yourself. But there's those little choices that built all together to create something special. And of course the world, the introduction of the Canary, the establishment, and that's a little bit more in the other games where it really shines, but still very strong. Like we talked about with magic and how that is reined in and representative of our psychological pitfalls. Absolutely brilliant, and an incredible start of giving us that special experience. So we talked about all the great shit. Fanny, what's some bad shit about my beloved? I have it in a locket. I have a picture of Dragon Age Origins in a locket that I stare at before I go to sleep. Now tell me why it's bullshit.
You have the lyrium earrings.
I do. Oh, that's a deep cut, baby. That's a deep cut.
I know.
You know.
I mean, I really do love this game too, but I think it's kind of the same problem that was exhibited in Inquisition as well. And I think it's the problem the franchise never really got over, which is that the kind of moral and thematic complexity that really does justice to the cohesiveness and depth of the world that they present you isn't dealt with until the DLC. So until we have the DLC, the Awakening DLC, you don't like the you have the Darkspawn are orcs, right? Like they're just a ubiquitous, totalizing evil that you have to fight against that darkness, right? And so when you have that as like the main narrative, just like with Lord of the Rings, right? You have that as the main narrative of like, yeah, we have to, kill the darkness, and this almost like Destiny-esque, on the nose metaphor. All the really interesting stuff is happening on the periphery, right? Where you have those like really tough, morally complex choices where there's no clear, benefit for doing good things sometimes. And you have to really decide, how am I going to approach an ethical life? And am I going to be a consequentialist where I'm just going to, in a utilitarian way, add up, what is going to get me the greatest and best impact in the world? Or are you going to stick to principle even when it's going to cost you or the people around you something, including their lives? And so I think it, by having this kind of really morally simplistic main narrative, it kind of sidelines the most compelling parts of the game, which they do develop in the DLC and later games as well. But I think that's kind of a problem with these early RPGs, is that they could have taken the originality exhibited in how they dealt with magic, and even with some of the political systems, and applied it to the main story itself.
Yeah, like, to the structure of narrative a little bit.
Yeah, if there was no Darkspawn in this game,
yeah,
I think it would have been incredible in terms of like just trying to navigate this world where you have different species interacting with each other and trying to basically
just like a French Revolution game or something like that.
Yeah, and solve the problems by even though you yourself are subject to that same factionalism by the fact that you have this origin story and you belong to a species with a historical context. And so I think it's a bit oversimplistic in its main storyline. I think that's kind of, thematically speaking, the big real pitfall. Other than that, I mean, mechanically, I already mentioned that
it's a little tough.
It's kind of it's mixing the strategic approach with kind of the cinematic third, like very close third and first person perspectives, and that could be balanced a bit better. I think some of the characters aren't really fully fleshed out as they could be. Like I think some of them, like,
you mean
Sten,
the dog, right?
Yeah, the dog. What is the dog's story? What is it? What's motivating him?
Let's figure that out. Can I fuck
like Sten?
The dog?
Like it's a touching moment when you get to like Sten's final moments and kind of unpacking his philosophy and why he is the way he is. But I would rather have less with more. You know what I mean? Like fewer side characters that you can get involved with more deeply, which I think happens in the later games with all these franchises. So I think it's trying to take on too much as an origin story, and so it kind of puts you at the center of this like world destroying crisis with, you know, the archdemon and the darkspawn and everything. And I think it, you know, could have been really like brilliantly new and transcendent without all those kinds of token-esque trappings to get us involved in the first place.
Yeah. Well, there we go, and I wouldn't disagree with that. So let's put this fantasy delicious cake on the shelf. Let's let it cool down, because of course you're supposed to heat up cakes. And let's grab this tasty prime rib. No, it's a cake. It's a hot cake.
Yeah, okay. It's a hot cake.
Let's grab this cold prime rib. These metaphors are delicious. That is Mass Effect. So Drew Karpyshyn says, you know what? I'm going to make something with aliens. How many penises do they have? Would be my first question.
Answer is none, because the main species that dominates the universe is going to be all female. So we're definitely going to cater to those gamer desires.
Yeah, no, yeah. There's definitely not. They could have been, even though their heads kind of look like blue cocks. But that I think I'm taking
They're
away.
all attractive. They're all blue, and they're all women. So, you know.
So tell me about Mass Effect. Tell me about Mass Effect.
So this is released before Origins, right? 2007.
Yeah.
We're just out of high school. Casey Hudson's directing it, and he directs the remainder games in the series. We have Drew Karpyshyn emerge as kind of the head writer for the first two games before Mac Walters comes in and kind of fucks up the third one a bit.
Absolutely.
Yep. And so it's kind of again, just like how Dragon Age Origins was traditionally token-esque in its origin influences. Yeah. Mass Effect, it kind of fits the Dune Star Wars narrative a bit too easily. Like, you have the Force in terms of having biotics and biotic powers, which are basically Mass Effect fields that you can control. The Asari, one of the races, can control them biologically, and then we can modify humans to control them as well. And so basically people as a species, humanity has just kind of emerged into the greater Milky Way galaxy and has found it populated by a lot of very anthropomorphic species. And so we have kind of like a core group of species that are quote unquote advanced enough to dominate politically. You have the Asari, the Solarians, the Turians, and the Quarians. I think those are all of those dominant races, right? Yeah.
Yeah, those are the dominant ones. And then there's the Volus,
the
and
Krogan,
the Elcor.
Yeah, you have the Krogan too. Yeah. And so basically humanity has entered into this political minefield where they're trying to assert their own power in the midst of a system that is much older than they are. And you discover, obviously, that, okay, there's some big, again, like world threatening evil in the forms of the Reapers, these basically sentient machine organisms that every 50,000 years come and destroy and harvest civilizations when they get to a certain point of advancement. And so your goal, again, is to kind of choose your background, emerge as kind of the human specter, which is like the Jedi warrior of the central political system of the universe, and figure out how to defeat the Reapers while everyone basically says, nah, they don't exist. We're going to get bogged down in our factionalism and our conflicts within the universe. And you have to kind of overcome both. Like in Origins, you have to overcome like social and special stratification while solving the big evil that's coming to destroy and envelop everything. So very similar in that way.
That's hidden at the beginning, right? We don't really know what the Reapers are until that very impactful scene with Saren as the main guy. So it's kind of a traditional story that opened up to an even more traditional story.
And so just like I think we framed it well with Origins in that it takes that broad Star Wars Dune-esque space opera narrative and then really interrogates it and shows you the capacity for originality and impact on the periphery of that central narrative. So, what I always liked about sci-fi as a genre, I think why it's one of my favorites, is that it replicates our own anxieties about living. How do we live constructively with each other, in the universe, right? And so you have all of the same problems that we have in the Mass Effect world, like you do in any good sci-fi. You have class conflict, right? There are people who are rich and people who are very poor and are exploited. You have racism in the form of, the racism between humans has oddly disappeared, of course, but symbolically, yeah, it's it's racism as a speciesism, I guess, basically as a stand-in for racism of, and it is really
Turians hate the humans. Everyone hates the Krogans. Quarians are dirt Arabs. They even sound like Arabs. That's how they present it.
Yeah, and I really do think that's effective with science fiction because it basically gives you a new original arena to look at these problems that you become so acclimatized to in your own life that you forget they're there. And so you have really touching moments where you see like Quarians that are basically like Tally when you first meet her, right? She's like severely under threat. You have like the amazing climactic moment with Rex, the Krogan, who basically wants to save his race from the genophage, the self-imposed genetic genocide, neutering and genocide, right? Like those themes of like genocide, historical oppression, settler colonialism are all things that we deal with now in the world, and by having it replicated in a sci-fi universe, you can really kind of take a step back and realize like the stark moral realities that are at the center of these problems, which is what I really loved. Again, the central conflict with the Reapers and Saren, I wasn't really interested in. The Geth in the first one are presented as a kind of, again, like an AI.
They're pretty limited.
Yeah, Skynet-esque evil. We got to fight and defeat the machines. And again, it's not till the DLC and the sequel games where they really interrogate the idea of what constitutes AI. And, with Legion, is AI its own type of life that we should respect. So all that's kind of on the back burner in Mass Effect 1, but I think it does in a really effective way introduce you to the world and universe that you're in. I think with Origin does that, but Origin's focus a lot on your chosen backstory, and I think with Mass Effect 1, it's not as varied.
Your origin.
Yeah, your origin. And Mass Effect's not as concerned with your situation, because
there's already a character, right? That's the big difference.
Yeah, you're a set character, and you can choose your background that affects your motivation for doing what you do, and that does come up in a few areas, not as much as in Origins.
It's a little limited,
but it's it's really dealing with you as a representative of humanity and humanity's obligations to a species, to different species that they've alternatively allied with or oppressed or have fought against. And so I think what Mass Effect does better than Origin is give you a context for exploring larger themes of like, how do we as people interact with beings that are wholly different from us? And of
I think
course,
you said the B word there, Zach. I might have to spank you for that one.
Beings?
Better.
Oh, better. Right. Oh no.
I will admit, I remember when you first get on I don't know if you have this same experience, but when you first go on the Presidium and you're able to talk with it's not even the AI, but there's a woman working there that can just explain to you like who the Elcor are and who the Asari are, and kind of slowly easing you into that world when you finally do reach the Citadel. That I do remember as a stark contrast to everything that's going on, especially in the first game of Dragon Age Origin. I didn't nearly care as much about the interwoven details of the dwarves, which was interesting, but they're still dwarves. I've never seen a talking jellyfish that can like feel my emotions. I've never seen these avian warlike Turians that represent different themes in cultures. I've never seen that before, and you became, and I think, a little more obsessed. I feel like the fan fiction and the love for those characters is a lot stronger too.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And that when you're not so tied to your influences, you can really kind of experiment. And when we get, Thane and the Drell in the second game too, of like, what if your memory was like absolute, right? Like each species can kind of be used to highlight the different strengths and problems of like confronting experience with like a different apparatus, a different form of consciousness. Like I remember in the first game, really like the Hanar that you can talk to on the Citadel really, I think, was one of the most stark representations of that, where they talked about kind of how they interact in a way almost without language, and they have to adapt to language to interact with all these other species, and in that way they're kind of more advanced. Like
their religion, the Enkindlers, that we eventually found out meant the Protheans, and how that developed in the later games was very, very powerful.
Well, even that, right? Like and that's what I really love, especially from teaching history of when you have a kind of like a universal experience, like all these species have interacted with the Protheans, which are kind of like the race that preceded all the races in the galaxy, and they gave us these Mass Effect relays that we can use to travel the stars.
There's actually the Protheans did not create the relays; it was the Unari that was Reapers. Before them.
Yes.
So and there's a species before them too that eventually became the workers on the Citadel. So pardon me.
Actually,
who gives a fuck?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
I'm getting mixed up. But you're taking this universal experience that it's basically, everyone is interacting with the same artifacts and background, but they're creating their own meaning with it. And I think that's like a really deeply human experience as well. Like in terms of, you look at like the different polytheisms of our cultures and whatnot, they're all addressing the same questions. And so just seeing that pop up in Mass Effect 1, I really loved, because it showed the value
it showed trying you to conceive
of different worldviews.
It didn't always force the narrative down your throat. It very much showed you. And
you have to search this out, right? You have to go and actually explore and talk. You don't just get kind of a breakdown in a simplistic expository way. Yeah.
Now, what do you think about because we talked most about the narrative, what about how like the actual combat worked and your interaction with the combat at that point?
I mean, this is older. This is the first big
11 years.
Bioware game in this series. Yeah, 2007. So it is clumsy in the sense of there's no real auto aim in terms of your powers. You have to, like, the biotics don't just magically hit your enemies like they did in the other games, where you can kind of curve them around corners and whatnot. So mechanically it's a bit kind of clunky, but what I really did appreciate, and what I really didn't like that they got rid of in the later games, was you could customize the power-ups to all your weapons and use all the weapons no matter your class, in almost obnoxious way where you don't really see the impact, but it does give you an excuse to get into the world. Like I learned, I forget the name, but like each company that had its own type of gun, and you would interact with like some representatives of those companies, and it would just be like, oh, I know that name. Oh yeah. Oh, so it's one of those little details that makes you feel like you're living in a really cohesive world. So I think in terms of the detail,
because you went to
building,
like Novaria, those companies that you've been buying their guns for, you've been using their guns, their brands, like Cassius Interactive and things like that. Then you go to a planet, and all of a sudden, wait, no, these, we're on like the corporate world. We know that these places have been fleshed out. You didn't get that in Origins.
No, and that's because, with fantasy, you can step even further from our own reality, with magic and everything else, and kind of like that feudal model for fantasy. But here, what I like about sci-fi is that you can really interrogate like complex economic problems thematically, like, capitalism, the fact I'm using this company's weapon to kill things and powering it in some kind of tacit way. Like that's really, like, those problems are a lot more proximate to our own, I think, than the ones in Dragon Age.
You don't have Darkspawn? You don't have Dragon Pro?
I closed the rift in my apartment years ago. Yeah.
Oh boy, you're about 2 games ahead on that shit.
Yeah,
so,
getting ahead.
When we're looking at the original Mass Effect, I'm trying to remember what that offered. I think what you're missing here that you haven't touched on enough was how important those characters were, how they represented the archetypes for almost all other Bioware characters in a lot of ways. We're talking about Garrus Vakarian, we're talking about Rex, we're talking about
still
Tali
my closest
Zora.
friends.
Yeah, so I think those characterizations were better. Using the B word, look what I did. I can only say it once. Than what we saw in Dragon Age, and I don't exactly know why. And
I think because
it's hard to put my finger on, but I'd love to know what you think about that.
Because I think in Dragon Age, like with Sten and whatnot, like the Qunari are kind of still very much on the periphery of Origins, and so. And like with Liliana, she comes in a bit later and whatnot. So you don't get a sense of the characters embodying and representing core world tensions in the same way. They're very much a bit more atomized in just like they have their own little minute concerns that you're kind of interacting with, which is intimate and lovely. But in Mass Effect, because we're dealing with like an interstellar travel and different species interacting in a very, very clear structured way, like your Quarian, like Tali has certain concerns because she's Quarian, and what's her name, the Asari woman, Liara, like Liliana and Liara are messing me up. Liara, right, has very specific concerns because not only is her mother the matriarch matriarch Benezia, who's one of the villains, but like she has this sense of like I have to represent my species, and my species has basically defined what my role should be in the universe, and how can I fulfill that, and what aspects of that should I kind of move against? And you see every single character, like Rex in that climactic moment where he's like has his gun on you and saying, I'm taking this cure for the genetic genocide of my people, even if it's arrived at through like this terrible experimentation, right, on Vermeer. And so there's a moment like that with each of those characters where you realize how macro problems of like macro political problems of sectarian warfare and tribalism, like are communicated in like the lived realities of specific people. And I think that's what you can do in this kind of like sci-fi space opera that you don't quite get in
They
Dragon
try to
Age
do
Origins.
that with moments like Sten and if you remember Wynn, that represented the Mage's Tower and the choices that were made there. So I think there's some of that, but I would agree that because we know what dwarves are, so it's easier to perhaps understand their connection, so it's not as endearing. Whereas when I think of the connection, like you said, between Rex and the Krogan, it becomes something different and something that we haven't necessarily seen before. So,
and like in Origins, all those species, I mean, I think Origins is more beholden to its influences because all those species are a bit separated, and your goal in Origins is to unite them together. So you don't have like, and because, you know, it's the feudal structure, you don't have like a world political system as much. You're just going between different cultures, right? They're pretty distinct. Yeah, and what I really loved about Mass Effect 1 is that it deals with our modern political problem and crisis, which is that we have just this huge intermixing of history, tradition, culture, and belonging that leads to oppression, that leads to obligation, and we're just trying to get a sense of how can we enact some kind of justice for people who have suffered as a result of these like big macro forces of history. And they really communicate that really well through their characters and Mass Effect, right? Because these species are forced to interact in the universe together much more than the species in Origin are, and so those political problems really, really do take the forefront and really are personalized through your companions more so than they are in Origins. And so I found Mass Effect 1 a lot more like politically relevant and compelling than Dragon Age Origins, which was compelling on a more intimate, personal level. It's also more
cinematic. Like it is frankly a more cinematic game, so it's easier to connect. Like I remember the framing of that shot between Rex, Ashley, and yourself on Vermeer. You know, I remember the mechanics of how that looked. I remember what the shot looked like when the Reaper spoke to you. With that deep voice. I don't necessarily remember the moments of how they were framed. I remember the feelings. I even remember some things that were said. So I think there's a hidden sort of power in both of these techniques. Isn't it interesting, though, that both of them, these games, which are wildly different in so many ways, still do try to stick to those core principles of player choice, world building consistency, and impact on player emotion. Like, let's just take a second to realize how astonishingly brilliant the people are that make these sort of games.
And I think it's so powerful because they haven't done what we've done and separated them so much. It's part of a total system, right? Like we need a consistent world that's built so that we provide the framework in which the player is going to make certain choices, or we're going to make the player feel the impact of those choices by having the player develop very clear relationships with different characters. And so they take that kind of approach. And so that's why like every world building detail, from any minor character that you just run into at a market and talk to the big kind of narrative that's pushing the plot of the game forward, has some kind of impact because it's tying back to a key theme or a key choice that you've made, and it's just it is absolutely incredible. I think these are some of the most cohesive games ever made in terms of telling a story. And it's not because they're aping like an RPG structure like a lot of games do now. It's because
they invented the RPG structure.
Yeah, and they're using that structure because it gives them the results that they are seeking for, right? They're not just taking it as a given. They're starting with these values of, we want players to connect with characters and have emotional experiences. How can we deliver that? And for them, it's the open RPG.
So finally, we have these two games. They've been represented. I think we've advocated for them as best they could. Let's take a second now and try to think about which of these games not necessarily comes out on top, but like I said, more effectively embodies those principles. So something like world building consistency. I am comfortable of giving that to Mass Effect. I think that did it a little bit better for the reasons that you said. It was new, it was exciting, and you kind of covered it there. The reason that you said were Origins had a more traditional Tolkien-esque representation, and also the characters, like you mentioned, more represented these themes stronger in Mass Effect. Player choice, what do you think about that?
I think Origins, because of the origin mechanic, really, like they're very similar, obviously, in terms of dialogue wheels, name of the show, and allowing you to affect the endpoint. But I also like the epilogue of Dragon Age Origins better. Like, I felt like more of my minor choices had impact, whereas in Mass Effect 1, I couldn't really see the impact of some of those minor missions until the second game, and even then, it's just kind of like a callback. It's not exactly like a core part of it. So I think with player choice, Dragon Age Origins did something in a game that has never been done before, which is give you a completely different version of a game.
Hundreds of different versions of the game.
Well, and just like it's the same. You're doing the same stuff, but you have a completely different perspective based on the choice you made in your origin. And I think I'm so surprised that hasn't been used.
It really hasn't.
Again,
it hasn't been developed since that time.
Yeah, and it's incredible. And Mass Effect has the background, but really you are just a human being.
I do want to say,
the midst of species.
Inquisition did kind of take that and added in the races, but just didn't have the origin thing. Like you can't fuck with a Canarian Inquisition.
I really love Inquisition.
Yeah,
I'm excited.
I hope we can get to that one because that's exciting. So we've given 1 to world building consistency for Mass Effect. We've given 1 to player choice for Dragon Age. Yeah. Impact on player emotion.
The tiebreaker.
Oh, baby.
Thing we just made up.
Yeah, the thing we just made up. This is a tough one for me. I was able to advocate for Origin, so I think it's a personal experience, but in terms of being able to make the player feel special and affected, and like they said, it gives them something to dream about, the thrills, the victories, the hate. I think there's more new emotional nuances in Origins because of its messy complexity, whereas Mass Effect, the first one was kind of setting the build that will then pay off subsequently, and paid off big
I think I can agree with that because with the Mass Effect series, I think it's stronger because you're staying with the same characters with each game. And so like really by 2 and 3, when you're like talking to Garrus at the end of the third one, when you're talking to all the characters that you've been on this ride with, like that is incredible.
Yeah.
But that's kind of unfair. Yeah. If we're talking about in terms of the first game, I think, I think I'd agree with you because Mass Effect is really...
It's close for me on that last one. It's very, very close.
I do really like that moment with Rex, and even the guy. Remember this Solarian commander on Vermeer?
Of course, hold the line, baby. Hold the line.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe I'm convincing myself now that it's Mass Effect.
Well, hey, I think this is a good place to leave it off of. I think that it gives it to Origins. I really want to know what everyone else thinks. Please tell us your thoughts, feelings, and if there's enough love for this or hate, we will continue on this. We're running out of time here, but again, I'm Andy Burkowski.
I'm Zach Fanny.
Just excellent. And this,
you've introduced me, outroed me every episode, and then you leave me.
Listen, you know what I did?
This is my Rex moment, and I choose to kill you.
Hashtag Renegade.
Yeah. Actually, the button came up. That's it. Renegade button, and
that's not in Mass Effect 1. So fuck you, Origins wins. All right, we'll be back. Dollar's Wheel.